welcome you to this podcast. I'm Don Knudsen. I'm a retired professional chaplain and also a pastor of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. I'm speaking about a subject very significant in my ministry that I wanted to share. And it's some of my own stories as well as stories of people whom I've ministered with and who have been part of my parish and in my work as a chaplain. I called it, my talk, A Spirituality During Times of Trauma and Loss. It was presented in September of 2022 at the Church of the Risen Savior in Catholic Parish, which sponsors and holds in their facility the SALT Ecumenical Lifelong Learning Organization that are called Seniors Learning Together. It's a ministry of Catholic, Lutheran, and Methodist and other churches and others that has been going on for 25 years as a way of encouraging and enriching seniors in their later life. And that happened 25 years ago, so they're celebrating the 25th anniversary of this mission. And my wife, Gloria, who passed away about a year and a half ago, was on staff at Prince of Peace Lutheran Church, one of the congregations. And she and others helped to conceptualize this program, and so I want to honor her in this talk as well, and I did at the time of my speech. So I'm going to turn over now the next of the podcast to my talk that I gave on spirituality during times of trauma and loss.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here today. I am sharing with you some stories and a little history. I want to show you, this is my wife, Gloria, and I want you to know that I'm honoring her in my memory as I'm speaking with you today. It was 17 months ago today she passed. This is my family descendants. That picture was taken when Gloria's death occurred, and over those few days we were all together, and my grandson, who lives in Prior Lake, thought it would be fun to put us all in line. And I'm the fat guy in the middle, if you can see that. Yeah. And to the right of me, to this side, is my oldest daughter, who's here today to help me out a little bit, and her family, descendants. She's a grandma too now. And then on my left would be over here is my youngest daughter. And I don't know how it happened, but each of them brought 16 people to their side of the family. So we were 32, and me in the middle made it 33. So it was a balanced picture. I am probably the Lutheran pastor with the most Catholic descendants. And if anybody wants to challenge that, I'm very happy to hear from you. I want to say, too, about who I am. I have come to know myself as the leftover. I was sitting in my sister's funeral back in 2019 down in Nebraska, sitting there realizing that with her death, I had no siblings to talk to. My brother had died, my sister now was deceased, and that was what came into my mind. It was like, I'm the leftover. I don't know, it just popped into my head, see. So I came home and talked to my daughters and told them of this feeling and experience, and I don't know which one of them said, well, Dad, leftovers after a big meal the next day often are better than the original meal was. And I said, well, thank you for that, but what if I'm a fruitcake? They get leftover too. So when you evaluate my talk, you can either say I was a real good leftover or a fruitcake. I think I would understand both of those. I'd like to tell you what spirituality is and what I'm talking about today. Spiritual practices that we are familiar with, 12-step spirituality, the AA and Al-Anon group. I hang out with that spirituality myself every week if I can. Very helpful in cleaning up and relating to one's relationships and how we are seeing ourselves in our communities. Talked about meditation. That's always been a part of traditions of faith. Centering prayer, I think, is one of those that we're familiar with. Many Roman Catholic practitioners have used that, and others among us Lutherans as well. Bible study, worship, we're familiar with all of those. What I want to talk to you about is something that I have not talked about to anybody before, so you're hearing it from me for the first time in these stories. This is spiritual happenings during times of trauma and grief. Some of those might be dreams, visions, even revelations, or near-death experiences. It's gotten to be a topic quite interesting to medicine. Medical docs and neuroscientists have been observing that, trying to figure it out. I'm from the 60s. Hey man, what's happening? I say that to my grandkids. They think it's funny. Lots has been happening. Birth, people have dreams, visions. There's tragedies, trauma, and we all know grief, sickness, and death. That's what's happening. Happening all the time, has been happening probably for longer than we can even imagine. Question is, what do we do with it, or what do we make of it? And how do we respond if we should have such moments in time? You might remember Ash Wednesday 2021. Anybody? Well, Prince of Peace happened to be using the practice of dispersing ashes out in the parking lot because of COVID. So I drove my car over there and I got the imposition of ashes, reminding myself that I'm mortal. And then I crossed the street over to the hospital where I had an appointment to get my first COVID shot. And so I took this picture with the cross on me, and there's a little button, I think it is at the bottom. I probably can't see it, but it said COVID, got my COVID shot. So my purpose that day was to remind myself I was mortal and then to go and see if I could postpone the inevitable. I think we've been doing that, haven't we? Many of us, most of us maybe. Okay. Catholic, Lutheran, we've got a tradition that I think has lots of power and is central, at least in my sense of our faith, Holy Week. You've all been to Holy Week services, have you? They're my favorite in ways that are extremely meaningful, but also very emotional. And we know the sacred story of Jesus. We know the trauma, the loss, and the grief that's in our scriptures and in our stories of our faith. Good Friday, Monday, Thursday, those were the ones that stick out, I think, and it's then that we see the last words, of Jesus to his disciples at the Last Supper. And then there's the betrayal. Somebody's going to betray me. And then there's the Garden of Eden, yeah, I wish it was. Garden of Gethsemane. They find themselves in a point of Jesus' arrest. Everybody takes off, and the next day it's crucifixion. The whole purpose of crucifixion is to scare the hell out of you. Make sure that anybody that opposes the powers that be to make sure that they are humiliated and put under the thumb. So the disciples, full of guilt, see the cruelty. Jesus suffers the last words on the cross. Hopes are dashed. Fear and grief are everywhere. Most of us probably avoid Good Friday. Go to church on Good Friday. Most of those services are small, not very well attended. But 2 days later, Easter comes, and boy, we're all out for our morning, beautiful, happy day, right? But you know, in the scripture, Easter morning is still full of disbelief. One of the stories is of the disciples experiencing that Jesus appears to them, and they're terrified, it says, and they think that they're seeing a ghost. And there's other stories as well. And when it's over, there's the question, is this real? And then we see finally joy. Spiritual stories in our scripture and in our faith that brings us together. My childhood spirituality, I'm going to tell a few stories. Grew up in the war, 1944. Parents were young. The war was on. They were just starting farming. My dad was not sure, I don't think, and neither of them would be very sure of how life was going to go. But along came a pregnancy, and that was me. My mother went to Sioux Falls for the birth. That was South Dakota, you understand. That's where I was raised from. Like my uncle always said, you know, South Dakota, it's a great place to be from. I don't know. That's a joke in the family, you see. Birth, November 22nd, 1944. I was born with a club, or not, it was a deformed foot, not club, but a deformed foot, I'm told. I still have evidence of that today. And then I was what they called a blue baby, which meant the oxygen wasn't going very well. Danger of infant mortality. Pastor was called, come down, and 2 days later, I was baptized in the hospital. Lutherans have baptism for the purpose of inviting you into the community or maybe as a last rite. Either way, I belonged. And that's the story I was told as I grew older. I am so grateful to be here. It's amazing I survived. I did, and I don't know how. But in that little family, we were struggling. I know my dad and mom didn't get along very well on some things. And I have a vivid memory as a little kid, maybe 5 years old. My mom and dad had a terrible fight. And my dad was raging about something, of course, I didn't understand. And he took off, banged the door, left the house, and this is out in the country. Got in his pickup and tore out of the farm. Boy, was that a memory. My mother is sitting in the kitchen sobbing, and I'm the little boy, 5 years old, coming to her to comfort her. And she says, I'm so afraid. I'm afraid he's going to shoot me. You know, guns are supposed to be for hunting. I've never forgotten that. The first funeral I was invited to go to as a kid, and I probably was a little bit after that, maybe 6 years old. And, you know, in my world at that time, I had very little understanding. Nobody talked to me about any of this. I maybe like you too. And so what happened is that one day my folks are standing around and said, well, do you think he's old enough to go to a funeral? Well, yeah, I think he's old enough to go to a funeral. I wanted you to know what my little mind was thinking. I was remembering my dad would go out and shoot pheasants, and so he had to kill things in order to go to have death. And I listened to the radio, and of course, I think the Korean War was kind of raging up just to that point, and so we would always hear about people being killed in the war, right? And I was afraid that my dad might shoot my mother. I thought in order to have a funeral as a little kid, I thought somebody had to be killed. I was terrified. Is it going to be me? I went to that funeral and was so relieved. When they took me up to the balcony, I could look down and there was a casket of somebody else. Trauma. Polio, that's what they said I had. Somehow in my infancy or in intrauterine. So I was to go and get some surgery. This was experimental days, what to do, and I was having a withered leg and my muscles were disappearing, and so we had to go from our little farm about 150 miles down to Sioux City, where there was a good Catholic hospital, where two doctors, Dr. Donahue and Dr. O'Donoghue, were doing things to help children like me. My parents took me down there, and I got dropped off and got into the hospital, 10 years old. And I remember that after they got me in bed, Mom and Dad said, well, goodbye, we'll see you. I had to go back and milk the cows. There was no money for staying overnight anywhere. So I was left alone. And in those days, when you went into the surgery, as a little kid, I'm put on the gurney, and nobody gives you any, thing to kind of relax you, those days that you just were there. And so they rolled me in, and I'll never forget those big knives and those saws. All of the, wow, what are they going to do to me now? I didn't know for sure if I was going to live through it in my little mind. But I did. I'm telling these stories because this is the shape of what called me to ministry. Trauma. Aware that this world has a lot of need for love, and I needed more of it myself. And of course, I wanted my parents to, be loving to each other, and then I could have security. So we all know those dynamics. Well, I did go into ministry, and I didn't know what I was doing, but I certainly learned a lot while I was doing it. I'm going to jump to another section here that says existential death anxiety. This is what I described to you. Scared. We're scared if we might die, Somebody could kill us, right? Everybody is communicating this in some way or another. Well, I'm bringing up a thing that through my ministry and time in your lives was going on, a lot of Billy Graham evangelism, I don't know if you ever went to any of his things, but he was always on TV too. And this is the question that was pretty central. Can you say that you know for certain that if you were to die today, that you would go to heaven? That's a question about your level of existential death anxiety. Are you scared? Well, I'm going to give you a little historical story, not my own, but one that hopefully I can read here in the dark. This is a story from a book called Bible in Pocket, Gun in Hand. Okay? University of Nebraska put this together and out of the historical West. Prairie Dog Dave. Thank you, that's great. Dodge City. He was not exactly a scoffer. He just got good and tired of preachers pestering him to come to church when he didn't want to. Finally, one ambitious roving evangelist, knowing of Prairie Dog Dave's stubborn reputation, asked a committee to go out and bring him in. That sounds like an interesting beginning for a sermon in a church, or well, this wasn't a church. The committee brought Prairie Dog Dave to Rowdy Kate's dance hall, where boards had been strung over the beer barrels for seats. And a pulpit was arranged at one end of the hall, and he sat down sullenly on a faro table in the rear while the minister delivered a sermon on the subject of being ready to die. Finally, Prairie Dog Dave could endure it no more. He rose up and, in a strong voice, addressed the preacher. "Mister, do you mean to say you're living that way? So good that you're ready to cash in at any old time?" "Well, yes, sir, I am," the evangelist answered. "Well, then you'd better get ready right now, because when you're sitting pretty," and he shouted out as he pulled 2 6-shooters and started picking up splinters at the preacher's feet. The preacher let out a yell and he dived behind a row of kegs. Quite a picture, huh? I'm glad I never had a Sunday like that. Prairie Dog blew the smoke out of his gun and said, "Boys, you see he's no more ready to die than I am." Yeah, even the preacher had existential death anxiety as he was talking about getting ready to die. So, a little of that, enough of that. I want to tell you a couple of stories now. This is a story about the woman who would not die. I was starting my training to be a chaplain way back. This was not here in the Twin Cities. This was up in North Dakota. And I was on call at the hospital, and I was called into a situation. And the story, the physician was there, and they were telling me, this woman is like 3 weeks, and she's been laying here in bed, and she's just skin and bones, and it was true. And she's not dying. We don't know why. And I said, okay. This family member was there. I said, "Do you have any idea?" "Well," she said, my aunt here, she was a very quiet, introverted person, very, very to herself. She didn't share much at all. I think maybe she's afraid to die." That was my pastoral care's cue. So I said, let's all gather around her bed, and I'll say a prayer, and I'm going to place myself in her place to pray as if I were her. And I did. Praying that this woman would know that God's love was there for her, that she need not fear. You know what happened? I said, "Amen." This woman of skin and bones, who had not shown any sense of life to anybody, sat straight up in bed and looked at me and then fell back. I've never forgotten it. So if they say to you that when persons are laying there looking comatose a little bit before they die, that maybe they hear you, Yeah, they hear you. This woman was afraid to die. And I was able, with others, to give her some help in a deep, deep time of her need. This next one is a lady that I had in a nursing home. She was one of those that, kind of a crusty little lady. She had a lot of spirit and spunk in her, and one of these southern ladies that had somehow got to Minnesota. And she was now coming to the end of her life. Her condition had taken a big turn, and she knew she was going to die. I happened to be in there and talking to her, and she just made a casual comment. She said, you know, I don't know if God or the devil's going to get me first. I thought, wow, that's an interesting statement. So her daughter was called, and we got together, and I asked her a little bit about her mother. I said, she made this statement, don't know if God or the devil's going to get me first. What's behind that, do you know? Because she was not in any way able to say much. And so what I learned is that she'd grown up in a really conservative little Baptist church in some town in one of the southern states. And she said, my mom rebelled against the family and against the church. She was probably a women's liber, you know, out to do her own life, right? So she rejected whatever the norms were that were there and left the family and ended up in Alaska and all around, who knows what else. But she was out and about. So it apparently was true that she still had within her the belief that by the fact that she had rebelled from her family and church, that maybe the devil's going to get me, because you know down south they say heaven is real, but hell is real. I like to mention that a lot. And she believed it. So what do we do? Well, that was another one, a difficult death. It took her some time. But we tried to pray with her and assure her, the daughter too, to get some sense of peace. Existential death anxiety. It's in about all of us to some degree. This is an interesting one. I have a little statement here that was reported. This is how it was stated. The way that we think about death can affect how we think and act in daily life. For example, a 2016 study had found that fear of death could amplify our desire for revenge and political violence. I think that sounds kind of like our society right now. Fear of death. Somebody's going to come and get me. I got to have my guns. Government's going to after me, you know. Scary. I'm afraid I'm going to die. I got to do something. I think that's some of what's going on. Now I'm going to tell you a little story about me again. Middle of my ministry in life, I was suffering depression. The church and my family and my colleagues knew that and saw it, and I had an intervention. I was intervened upon. And the only part I'm going to tell you about is a little piece of time between when I was intervened upon and temporarily hospitalized, and then was going to go to the treatment center for a month's help. In that between time, I had a contract with one of the chaplains in the local hospital who was to keep an eye on me, and I was having a terrible anxiety. Of course, everything was falling apart. Everything that I had thought I was able to do was gone. And so my wife at the time said, you got to call the chaplain, and I did. And this is what he told me. He said, Don, you just take some deep breaths and go into your bedroom, lay down on the bed, And I want you to visualize Jesus come to minister to you. I was desperate. I did it. I laid down on bed. I can tell you I couldn't visualize a thing. I was just sitting there thinking, I can't even visualize Jesus coming to minister to me. And I fell into the greatest sense of grief. And in that grief, in that sobbing, a very clear image of Jesus' suffering was present to me. And I said, oh, now I understand. And I want to tell you that I've not told this story, but to me this has been the spiritual experience that gave me the grace to be with others who suffer, to know that God is with us when we suffer, to know that God is not going to abandon us when we fail. I want you now to hear another story. I just told you my Good Friday story, didn't I? This is a woman who is in extreme grief, kind of like what I was, even more so. This woman, her husband, had a diagnosis of cancer, and this was in my first parish and long ago. And I went to see them. He had been told by the doctors, there's nothing more that we can treat that would help, and basically said, get ready to face your maker. But she was not going to let that be the truth, because she knew her husband could be cured. And she went to some doctor that gave her that hope. And she did this, and I was visiting her, and this is the picture. I'm there, and she's up in the kitchen. She's making up some stuff, vegetables and fruit and all this sort of thing and whatever. She was going to feed him this because this was going to stop the cancer. And he's sitting on the sofa, and he has jaundice, yellow, the liver wasn't working. And he looked very, very pale otherwise. And I thought to myself, what is going to happen here? She ended up in deep grief. Well, what did she do? I came in, and again, kind of like my mother, was sitting in a chair just sobbing. And they said, she's been this way for 2 days. We don't know what to do. And so I sat with her, and I tried to give her some comfort, and it was obvious she was just tight, just tight. And there was nothing I could say either that could help her. So that was the situation. I left feeling failing. I didn't help her. But I said, what is she going to do? Go to the funeral? How is she going to make it? Well, she did, and the funeral occurred, as you would imagine. And so maybe a couple weeks after the funeral, I went over, of course, to see her and see how she was doing. I couldn't imagine this woman with such grief. How is she going to be managing it? Well, she's got to be in just a terrible place. This is devastating. Oh, hi, Pastor, come on in. You want a cup of coffee? My kind of lady. I'm just checking in on you, wondering how you're doing. Yeah, she said, Pastor, do you believe in ghosts? I hadn't had that question before. I'm not even sure what I do believe about ghosts. I said, well, tell me, what happened? Well, she said, I was up here in the kitchen the other day and doing my thing, and I just looked up, and there was Willie. He was just down there in the hall right there. And I said, really? Tell me about it. Yeah, she said, yeah, he smiled at me. And he said, you know, you're going to be okay. You're going to be okay. And she could see that he was okay. And then she said, you know, he was gone. And then she started to say, you know, I've been thinking, what am I going to do? And when I think about it, she says, I think, well, what would Willie do? Yeah, you know, I remember him talking that the roof needs to be replaced. She said, you know, I think that's what Willie would. Yeah. And then she went on and on talking about what would Willie do. And I got sitting there thinking, oh my God, I have just experienced a phenomena that has to be a lot like Easter. Wow. This could be real. She seemed to do well. I drove by her house, I remember a couple months later, and by golly, the guys were up roofing her house. It was working. Willie was wonderful. Well, now I've got the last one here that I'm going to share with you. I don't know how my time is going here. I'm doing good.
Can I ask a question about how that widow was like a year later? In grieving, a lot of times things come back to hit you in the face again.
It's amazing. This particular vision must have been incredibly powerful and changed her sense of what normally we would have with grief and what I've experienced. Those things are unbelievable. Now, she probably had some issues, of course, that were practical, but very interesting. Totally extreme, and that's what I want you to want to mention is that these are extreme. These things don't happen every day. This is about a car accident. This is something that's in my family. I'm telling my children about what I'm talking to you about, that I was going to do something like this, and my youngest daughter said, you know, I haven't told you about this. She said, but you remember we had that accident? We came home from the cities and I fell asleep and the car rolled and so on. And all the kids were all buckled up and everything. I remember that because we went out there to see how they were, and everybody was okay. But her oldest boy had gotten whacked pretty hard on the side of his head, and he had a bruise and so on, and that. But and her husband too had some minor injuries, if you would. She said to me, you know, after that accident, my oldest, who's about 8 years old at this time, came to her and said, Mama, did you know that I died? She said, you did not, you're here. You know? Oh, no, Mom, he said, you know, when we had that car accident, I don't know, but he said, I was with Jesus, and I was crying because I wanted my mama. And Jesus said, well, are you sure? Are you sure? Yes, I want to go back. I want to go back with my mama. And Jesus supposedly said, at least it's been reported to me, and it's in the family, well, okay. And when you do, why don't you just tell them that I'm real? Now, he was an 8-year-old boy. And he got knocked out. And I'm thinking from the medical point of view, these phenomena, when they occur in trauma, they're part of the symptoms of what our health might need to know. But you know, a story like that, I've never talked to my kids or grandkids that this could be possible. This is not a conversation that I've had. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, this has got to be something we start talking about. That if something like that happened, it may say something about brain trauma. I don't think anybody checked him, about concussion or anything, but he probably had one. So that's the medical side that I'm thinking about at this point. All right, now I have the very last story. I'm going to tell you the spiritual story of my mother's death. My mother died about 1998. And I can tell you the story with some sense of authority because I wrote down, documented our experience. And my mother was, she lived to be about 81. She had congestive heart failure at the end. She had heart trouble. She had a pacemaker, that sort of thing. And what happened was she got sick with sepsis. And we all know about sepsis. Very, very bad infection. Well, she was hospitalized for that sepsis. And one day I got a call from my brother, and my brother is a funeral director. And he said, Mom's talking real strange today. He said, I don't know what's going on, but she wants to talk to you. And so I got my mother, and my mother said, Don, I want you to know that I'm dying. And I want you to know that I love you. And I want you to know that I'm very, very grateful for you. And I thought, whoa. And then my brother came back on, and he said, yeah, he said, that's what, I don't know what's going on. He said, that's the way she talked to Janet and me, my sister and him. So my mother became very aware she was dying. It was very clear. And that was, I'm never going to forget that. There was another episode that occurred when she was in the hospital before she went on hospice, which she did do. And this story is that she had a very strange phenomenon experience, and this was the nurse coming into the hospital room to check on her vitals and whatever she needed to do. And my mother, and my brother is the one to witness this, he was standing outside the door, and so he's the one that told me this, so it's secondhand to me. My mother said to the nurse, don't you know I'm dead? Yeah. Don't you know I'm dead? My body's going to be taken by the Kinsley Funeral Home. I want you to know. My mother advocates for her son's business. My brother comes hearing this. He comes in and he says, I'm Larry Knudsen from the Kinsley Funeral Home. Mother, would you just roll over and let the nurse do what she's supposed to do? That's our family. Yeah. I've never forgotten that story. But I got curious. Don't you know what was that? Why would a person who's dying say, don't you know I'm dead? Now, I'm a chaplain in a nursing home, and I had an experience before this of a woman who I had gone to visit, and she was sitting in a room, and she asked me, am I dead? I thought, gosh, this sounds like that lady. My mother was saying stuff like that lady. That lady back at the nursing home, she's still living. I'm going to go back and talk to her. And I did. And here's what I can tell you. When I asked her this, I said, do you remember when you said to me, am I dead? I said, can you tell me what was going on? Oh, she said, yes. It was beautiful. She said, the trees and the birds, it was just gorgeous, the flowers. And my sister, she was playing some hide and seek with me. We were having a lot of fun. And then he would go up, and then he would come down, and she talked about how and her story was this beatific, wonderful, I must be in heaven. I must be dead. I said, who went up and who went down? Well, Jesus, of course. You dummy chaplain. You're supposed to know these things, right? Well, this is what I'm telling you. That if you ever hear somebody in a nursing home or anywhere else in your family who might say something odd, that's probably what's happening. Another story in the nursing home, these residents were being taken up to their rooms after lunch, and I'm walking there, milling around, and this lady who I know very well, she was over 100 years of age, she's laying in her wheelchair, kind of her eyes closed and her head up, and she said, "Is this heaven?" And one of the staff said, "No, this is Ebenezer." Amazing, isn't it? Now, another thing I need to tell you is my mother she was transferred to the nursing home for her hospice. The hospital took her in her initial cares, and then of course she didn't want any of what they could offer, which maybe was little or nothing. And I want to tell you one of my most powerful spiritual stories in that regard with my mother, because everyone had left. I was the last one in the room with her before they were to transport her. And Mom is laying on the bed with, the typical end-of-life look, but she's hearing me. I gave her some comfort. And then I said, "Mom, I'm remembering the story about your dad, my grandpa, when he was in the hospital, and he'd been there for a month or two, and he called you up to come into the hospital." Yeah. And you remember when he told you that 2 angels had just come in his dream the night before to tell him that he needs to get dressed because he's going home? Mm-hmm. And he died that night? Yeah. I bet you're really looking forward to seeing your dad, huh? And she said, yes. Mm-hmm. And I told her, I said, "Mom, one day I'm going to be where you are. Are you going to be there for me too?" And really, yes. And I felt this deep connection to her and to my grandfather in that moment, which was so deeply spiritual and connective. That's what is important in life, I think, to feel those connections, very spiritual connections. So there you are. My mother goes to hospice in the nursing home. The nurse comes to take her intake and invite her to answer questions. And one of the things that I want you to know about my mother was that she held bitterness about the divorce of my father to her for all of her life up until that point. And to the nurse, who became the mother confessor, she said to the nurse, "I've been holding this grudge and this hurt all my life, and I'm ready to let it go and to forgive." You have to let go of everything when you come to the end of your life, right? And she did. I was so grateful to hear that story. And then I want to just tell you a little bit, being I'm Catholic Lutheran in my family, and my mother grew up out in the western part of South Dakota and ended up back to the eastern part of South Dakota, and she was raised Baptist and married a Lutheran. And then she became more Lutheran than any Baptist would be, and that was who she was for our faith and how we grew up. But my brother, he had married a Catholic. And when he married the Catholic, I was just ordained. And in those days, the ecumenical movement was just getting going. And Catholic priests were actually letting Lutheran pastors co-celebrate weddings. And I got to be the first one to do that in our little town of Salem, South Dakota. And my brother and his wife and I was part of that, and I will always remember that. Well, my mother coming back to Salem, where my brother was living, is where she ended her life. And my brother was, of course, caring for her and many of her needs. And she got to know through the Senior Citizen Center all of those people in the community, and many of them were Roman Catholic. In the nursing home, of course, there were seniors that were needing help and health care. So here's what happened in the nursing home. I'm there. This lady comes over to me. She was a lady that lived in the apartment that my mother did. They were neighbors. She said, I want you to tell that Father was here, and I asked him, and he said Mass for your mother. Oh, okay. That's pretty good for a Baptist lady who married a Lutheran. God bless them. And then I turned around and I looked in my room. There were 2 beds in a room in that little place, and I saw the lady who was in the bed next to my mother. She'd gotten up, and she had her little holy water bottle, and she was standing over my mother, sprinkling her and blessing my mother. I had a Catholic lady bless my mother. And not only that, well, our pastor came, and he wanted to give communion, because that's, of course, what we Lutherans might do. But my mother at this point couldn't swallow anymore, so that was not going to work quite that way. And he was disappointed. But I said, come on. I said, we need you to bless her, and she needs to hear it from you. And that was a wonderful service, too. And she relaxed, and she felt this peace. I could tell. But then I turned around, and there's a couple coming down the hall, and they said, we're here, and we would like to say the rosary for your mother. Would that be okay? Now, what I'm telling you is, this is my ecumenical life. But it also tells me that we all have our rituals that we need to do when something significant happens. I don't know if us Lutherans have any rituals anymore, particularly. I just don't know. But we certainly in our Catholic tradition here, with the tradition that's been a long time, and I don't know where practices are in people's faith, but those were very meaningful rituals. And then when the funeral happened, it was at the Lutheran Church, of course, but the Catholic guitar choir that my sister-in-law was in sang at the Lutheran service. So I'm just telling you, isn't it wonderful? There was so much hatred and fear between Catholic and Lutheran growing up. We weren't to talk to each other. And now here we were. So I'm telling you these stories just to trigger your thoughts about what's important. I think that was, did I just now? Okay. What's important? We're all going to die. Let's be real. Clear up your relationships. My mother had to do it, but she did it way at the end. She could have done it 20 years ago. Maybe life would have even been better. But that's history. You can't go change the past. But we can all, and we all have our issues. So there it is. And we need to talk about this subject as normal part of life, instead of hiding it, as though it's somehow, scary. Don't sweep this subject under the carpet. Although I know it's going to be hard to not do that with lots of our feelings of fear. And then we should learn about what may happen to us when we die. I'm telling you stories that are marvelous. And teach people in your life and yourself not to be afraid of dying. And I'm going to tell you the story of my great aunt Hilda, my grandfather's sister, good Norwegian. I went to visit her after I was ordained, always had cake and coffee. Good conversation. I remember trying to tell her a Norwegian joke, about Ole, and that, she said, gee, it's just terrible the way they talk about the Norwegians. It was just terrible. She married a Swede, and he had passed, so she was like my age now, and she was a widow for a number of years, and so of course I realized I really offended her, so I told a Swede joke on Sven. Oh, yeah, that is the best. That's the best joke I ever heard. So I just want you to know that's where I came from. The war between the Swedes and the Norwegians and their sense of humor. I loved her. I'm sitting there drinking my coffee and talking and chatting, and then finally she said, Donnie, I got something to tell you now that you're a pastor. I thought, oh boy, what's going to happen now? She said, Donnie, Jesus comes and appears to me quite frequently. And I can tell you that we have absolutely nothing to fear in death. Do you believe it? Was she hallucinating, maybe? I guess so. I don't know. Do I believe her? Lutherans only believe what's in the Scripture, right? Huh? Well, she believed in the Scripture, too. She was raised a good pietistic Lutheran. And I got some of that in me, too. So those are my stories today for you, and I want you to think about this in your life. I think that you also may have stories of your own. I don't know. But I have a feeling at least one or two of you may have stories even better than mine. And maybe some of these stories could get woven into our spiritual communities as part of the feeling that we're really living in tune with something that's real. Whatever that means, real. So, with that, I want to thank you very much.